Here's a potentially unpopular opinion. I think reading the news is one of the worst ways that you can spend your time, and here's why. Broadly, we spend our time on two types of activities: being productive or being entertained, and the news has limited application in either case. In regards to productivity, generally the news gives shallow insights with articles and opinions that are either irrelevant or will be in a short amount of time. The news is high noise and low signal, a mental model I'll explain in this video. Also, as far as entertainment goes, the news is designed to pull us in with headlines or imagery to evoke emotional reactive states, leaving us feeling anxious, angry or depressed. One of the reasons that I think people read the news is so they can feel politically informed, so they can appear intelligent at dinner parties. And I haven't actually read the news for 5 years, but I can still hold a conversation on most topics. And in this video, I'm going to talk you through a different approach to reading the news that's still going to let you be politically informed. It's the second video in my mental models series, where we attempt to look at the theory behind really powerful mental models and how they can help us think better, and then relate it to practical applications. So if that's something you're interested in, press subscribe. I release a new video in this playlist every month. First, we're going to talk through the theory of signal versus noise, and then show how this relates to media consumption, focusing on the news, which I believe to be a very high noise media type. Then we're going to look at the very valid arguments about why we should be reading the news, but look at a different way of addressing these arguments so we can still get the benefits of the news, but in a much higher signal way. I'll leave the timestamps here if you want to jump around, so let's get into it. Signal versus noise, or more correctly, the signal to noise ratio, is just the relationship between the desired output of something, that's the signal, versus the non-desired output, which is the noise. And the easiest way to explain this is to actually look at an audio recording. So here you can see a waveform from my voice currently, and you can see as I'm speaking, you can see the waveform going up and down, and that's the signal. But when I stop speaking, you can still see that there's a waveform, and that's actually the noise, and that's just the background noise. It's the chatter of the birds, it's the washing machine going, it's the interference of the electrical systems. And this noise is actually always here, even when I'm talking. It's covered up by the signal. The calculation for this is a very simple one. It's just the desired output, which is the signal, over the not desired background noise, which is the noise. And that gives you the signal to noise ratio. Probably goes without saying, but you obviously want as high a signal to noise ratio as possible. Let's bring one more element into this theory, which is the element of time. So imagine that you own a casino and you're wanting to get an insight into the profitability of that casino. If you looked at it on a yearly basis, you'd probably really be able to make out the signal trend. You'd see that perhaps over Christmas time, the profitability spiked as you brought in more clients, and there'll perhaps be lulls in other areas of maybe January, where people have spent all their money so can't go gambling. Now, if you then narrowed that in, so you were looking over a much shorter period of time, say a day, the fluctuations between the ingoings and the outgoings, what you're getting in from the bets going your way and what you're paying out for the bets that don't go your way, there's going to be massive fluctuations in there, and it's going to be very difficult for you to make out what the actual trend is. Now, if you focused in even more on, say, an hour, it's going to be basically impossible for you to even probably see if that casino is going to be profitable. And this is a general rule of thumb with signal versus noise. The longer period of time that you look over it, the higher the signal to noise ratio. So how does signal to noise relate to the news? Well, as you're reading the news, you're reading the events as they're reported. So the timeline that you're looking at is very narrow. And this isn't helped by the fact that no matter how much news there is in a day, newspapers have to be the same size, blogs or news sites have to publish a certain amount of articles, because otherwise the media outlet that's publishing this news isn't going to make any money. And this is really the fundamental problem with the news. By looking in on such a sort of narrow time period and listening to all these opinions that probably are just there because they need to make money, it's really not a good way for you to see an overall picture about what's going on in the world. And this big picture understanding of the actual issues that are being reported is so vital if we ever want to truly understand and maybe even one day change something about the world. Usually arguments in favour of reading the news will go something like this. We're citizens in a global world, and it's really important that we understand what's going on in the world so that we can make some sort of change in it, or at least be aware of these things that are happening around us and what's bigger than us. And this is a very valid argument, but I really don't agree that reading the news is going to help people develop this deep holistic understanding of the world around them. Take the example of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is an incredibly complicated issue that has been going on for hundreds of years and involves layers of prejudice and social inequality. Do you really think that by reading the news and being triggered by all the protests going on and the increasing levels of police brutality is really going to help you get a sort of really deep understanding of the root of what is going on? I really don't think it does, and I think that what the news is doing is trying to evoke in us some sort of emotional response to these things that are going on, rather than presenting us with what's actually happening. And that's where I think long-form literature can really come into its own. There's a general rule of thumb that if something has been around, a piece of media, for a certain amount of time, you can probabilistically expect that it's going to be around for that amount of time longer. For example, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the book's, a couple of thousand years old, people are still reading it today, and probably in 2,000 years you could make the case that a number of people will still be reading it. Now, could you make that argument about a piece of news that has been written that's maybe been around for 3 months or a day, or indeed a book that's only been around for 3 months or 6 months? You could probably expect that people are still going to be consuming that media in 3 months or 6 months' time, but do you really think that that argument is going to be relevant in 2,000 years? Potentially not. Now maybe you're in an open state of mind that perhaps the news is not the best way to really understand the issue, and I'm just going to explain to you the strategy that I've been using for the last few years to really just try and make a bit more sense of the world around me. And I'm going to use something that we're all familiar with, the coronavirus example. So when it comes to coronavirus, there's a few different actions that I've seen around me people taking. The most common one is people will tune into the news and sort of see the daily updates of the deaths and what's going on. And while this can give some indication of the trend that's going on, because you're looking at such a narrow portion of the timeline of the coronavirus, it really doesn't give us that big picture understanding. And this is probably one of the reasons why coronavirus became a pandemic in the first place. If instead people had put their mind to understanding statistics, exponential growth is not a complicated mechanism to understand. You're just saying that over a set amount of time, something multiplies by a set amount. So, with coronavirus, it might be every 6 days the amount of cases doubles. And if politicians and everybody were truly, aware of this and truly understood it, I really don't believe that we would have had the issue with coronavirus that we did, because right from the outset, it would have been so clear how quickly something from a seemingly very small amount of cases could grow to the level that it's at today. Likewise, everyone has been massively shocked, I think, by how unprepared everybody was for this pandemic. But if you actually read something like The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb and really understood human psychology when it comes to thinking about risk, you would understand the point that when humans think about risk, they don't think about the worst possible scenario. What they actually think about is what's the worst thing that's happened in the past, and then use that as a benchmark. And because the coronavirus pandemic was in a lot of ways worse than anything that's happened in the past in terms of the speed that it can travel, we were just completely unprepared for it. One more thing that I've read over the coronavirus period, which I found really helpful, which is the lessons on Stoicism in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And all this book really teaches is, sort of wisdom that's thousands of years old, and it tells us how some things you can be taking control of and some things you can't. And ultimately, you just need to understand what's your circle of influence, what can you control, and focus on that. and not be worried about the things that you ultimately can't control. And I'd argue that, taking a step back from watching the news and being constantly updated on the deaths and the sort of micro progressions in the disease, and actually trying to understand the disease as a whole through understanding how deadly it is, understanding why you can't really expect the government to be prepared, and also really knowing what you can do in your circle of concern to make the most of a bad situation, is going to serve you a lot better than being really involved in these sort of micro updates that are going on. So thanks a lot for sticking around to the end. I hope you found that helpful in some way. Today we've gone through the mental model of signal versus noise, why you want to be sort of pursuing high signal, low noise media or information sources before relating that to the news, and why the news is really a very high noise media source, and talking through a few different ways that we can get information in a really high signal way through looking at books that have really sort of more stood the test of time. If you found this helpful at all, maybe you've got a friend who you think is obsessed with the news, you can share this with them, see if you can change your mind. And also, if you completely disagree with what I've said, I'm more than open to hearing the criticism. My views, on these things are always changing. This is just something that I've found in the last 3 years or so has worked for me. So thanks a lot and enjoy the rest of your day.